Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 51 of the 75 Days of Partition. My name is Gunita, and I have been co-hosting this series with Aprajita Dagar, Sonam Kalra, and we're also going to have a guest appearance from Noor Anand Chavla. So today, Fahad is back, and we are going to continue discussing newspaper headlines from 1947, specifically from July. So Fahad, how are you doing?
I'm good. Hello, everyone. I'll be
You
discussing from 18th July till 22nd July, so basically this week.
And can you tell us, before we dive into it, what are some of the sort of really big points that stand out to you in July?
So one was the start of the referendum of the Northwestern Frontier Province, so which started at 6th July, and we'll see the results of it in today's presentation. So the result came out on 20th July. So that is one, and the separation of the cabinets of the interim cabinet, it was joined between India and Pakistan for a while, but now we also see them breaking up, and then separate ministers would be assigned for India as well as Pakistan. We have the list in the presentation also. We also have the boundary commission was for Punjab and West and Bengal. They were done with the report, but the result of the report, what the outcome would be, would only come out in August. So, but the report was done, and then of course Cyril Radcliffe lands in India, Lahore. Lahore, yeah, he landed in Lahore on 14 July, I think.
And do
So
you
we will,
think that even though, was this being published in newspapers? Do you start to see
yeah,
headlines? Okay,
yeah.
fascinating, fascinating.
We also have a image of Cyril Radcliffe from
Oh,
14
that's
July.
great. Do you want to start putting up your presentation of the newspaper headlines?
Yeah. So we'll start with 18 July, which was Monday. So it has news from 17 July. So one of them was that boundary commissions had to submit the report on August 10, which was completed by this point. And we also see that in Lucknow, for example, I put it specifically because the time we see the turmoil that was happening, the people losing lives to man-made violence, but also they were losing lives to natural disasters. Rain only fell for like 10 hours, but it was so much that 8 people lost their lives. There was extensive damage to infrastructure, and Miss Vijayalakshmi Pandit, she mostly blames it on the municipal functionaries, that they were not doing their jobs, but they were also busy in containing the violence. So yeah, so also like they were not prepared for more natural disasters at this point because they were so busy in containing the human made disasters at this point.
You know, what's
uh,
really fascinating is I've been watching some of my old interviews that I did 12 years ago. And one of the things that really sticks out to me, especially from people who were adults in 47, because, 10, 15 years ago, we were still interviewing people who were adults, is they talk about, the wildest rains, and they've never seen them since that year. And they hadn't seen them before that year. So that year somehow seemed to have very, very torrential monsoons that really
yeah,
impacted everything.
I think the paper also mentioned that since 1861, yeah, it's written here, since 1868, this was the hardest that it ever came
Incredible.
in Lucknow. Yeah. We also have news coming in from West Bengal that refugees from Bihar, they had migrated to West Bengal, but the government was not able to take care of them anymore because the spending was roughly 40,000 rupees a day. That was like 70 lakhs they had spent so far on the refugees from Bihar, and now they wanted them to leave and go back to Bihar, and they were just incentivizing them to repatriate back to Bihar.
And was it happening? Did people start to repatriate?
No, not yet. They were trying to incentivize them, but that's what they wanted. Uh, but that was not happening yet. So that we will see post August.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we also have, of course, the it was like the violence happened every day. Now there were armed robberies, and in Calcutta, in Lahore, they also found 2,700 around 2,700 homemade bombs, and just the daily carnage of lives that happened every day.
And who found them and where did they find them? That's really
Oh
curious.
yeah, so the police officers found them. I think they were headed by British people at that time. one of the British officers sent a sort of a brigade, and then they found 2750 roughly explosives. And then armed robberies were becoming more and more common. Earlier it was more inclined towards mob lynchings, but now it was happening more sophisticatedly, more
Interesting. And
planned.
I'm going to relate this back to interviews again. I have interviewed people who talk about making homemade bombs. That was quite a trend amongst certain groups who were making homemade bombs. I also interviewed a person who remembers these women who saved their kafla in the Naraval district, and two people have confirmed this. There were these women traveling with these homemade bombs, and they were kind of deploying these bombs on mobsters and insurgents that were coming after them. So I think this homemade bomb discovery is really fascinating because it confirms what we hear in the interviews.
Yeah. And yeah, but mostly in the newspapers, it's usually shown as a means to commit violence. But like you said, in interviews, they also used it for protection from violence.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's a really interesting point to consider.
Then also we see Lord Ismay. His mission in London. He wanted to have a defense pact between India, Pakistan, and Britain in place before they formally uh, come into existence as two new dominions. So he wanted a defense pact. They also wanted Burma, but the talks with Burma were still ongoing, and they wanted a settlement with territories that included also Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and Andaman and Nicobar Islands as well. So they wanted
And
a defense pact in place before they leave the land.
and as somebody who has done a lot more research on this than most of our viewers, what ended up happening in the long term with that? Do you want to tell the viewers?
About the
Yeah.
defense pact. So, of course, then Nehru was more inclined towards the non-aligned nations, and Pakistan it was part of the bloc that was led by Britain and the US.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
This was also the time. This was also the time in South Africa saw a lot of hatred and discrimination towards Indians who were living in South Africa, and since Mahatma Gandhi had personal stake in that, so he wrote a letter to both Jinnah and Nehru, and he said that it's your responsibility to ensure that Indians everywhere in every part of the world, wherever they will be, you have to ensure their safety, and you should send a joint telegram to the leader of South Africa, then General Smarts, and do tell him that if you cannot ensure the safety of Indians in South Africa, you should resign. And yeah, that was the letter Mahatma Gandhi sent to Nehru and Jinnah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And this letter was somehow made public because it's in the newspaper.
Yeah, 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 it's in the newspaper. On the left, you see a photo of it's one of the rare photos of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. So I thought like it would be really interesting. And with him is Mr. S. Ane. They were both part of the Constituent Assembly, and it's a photo that I thought everyone should see. There are
That's
very rare, there are very few photos of Dr. Ambedkar, and so I put it up. And
Thank
there
you.
was also and there was also a decision to be taken on a recruitment of Gurkhas for the British Army. So now we see that there was a tripartite agreement between Nepal, India, and the British that Nepal would supply Gurkha soldiers to both the armies. But the emperor said he's ready to do that as long as the Gurkhas want to do it voluntarily. And now we see Indian army has 6 regiments of Gurkhas, and the British army also has a brigade of Gurkhas. It's called the Brigade of Gurkhas.
And what was the
So
impetus for
yeah,
doing this for Nepal to provide their soldiers to the Indian and British Army?
one would be employment, because it's a source of employment, I think. And the other was to have good relations with both India is the neighbor that Nepal has, and you can't change your neighbor, so it would want cordial relationship with that. And with the British, like India and Pakistan had the same reason to cooperate with the British, I think Nepal would also have that, just security.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, and then we move on to 19th July. So yeah, finally the Independence Bill, which was it received royal assent, that gave way for the parting of the interim cabinet into two separate ones, one for India and one for Pakistan. Um, and on this day, Clement Attlee also sent a message to the Indian people. He wanted both the people from both the countries to look at this through a lens of hope, and that he hoped also that all three of them will together join efforts to bring a peaceful to make a peaceful and a prosperous world. That's the message that he sent to the Indian people. And later we also see no and we also see that they were trying to make efforts to build defense pacts around it also. So that was the motive behind that.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
That's a really important date, 19th July, for this reason.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the time when this cabinet broke into two. Also, we also see the day India independence ill received royal assent, the the Maharaja of Faridkot, along with the other six states of Majha, Malviya, uh, they held a Panthic conference, and they said, if Hindus and Muslims have the right to self determination, so do Sikhs, and that he will do anything and everything in his power to ensure that the Sikh struggle for independence and for self determination will last longer. 20,000 Sikhs attended this conference.
This is really interesting. My family is from Faridkot, and we know that some really strange things happened to these Maharajas specifically after partition. For example, the Faridkot Royal Library was completely burnt down, and that had rare books from centuries that had its history. It's a very, very old city-state that's been around for perhaps thousands of years, because we see that from the Indus Valley ruins. And, since since Sheikh Fariduddin's time as Faridkot. So I just wanted to throw that little history bit in there to highlight the significance of what it meant. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what that meant in terms of soldiers. Okay, go ahead.
Also, like I said, I mentioned before that 6th July, the referendum for the frontier province had started, and it was to be declared on 20th July. So, but this news is from 17th July. It was published in the paper only 19th July, because it's from Amrita Bazar Patrika's own correspondent, who was placed in frontier province, and the news took like 2 days to deliver. So here he has not a message, a response from Dr. Khan Sahib, who held British responsible for the frontier, because it went to Pakistan in the referendum by a very slight margin. By the transfer of frontier province to Pakistan, it won by 50.49%, like a mere 0.49%, and that's why it went to Pakistan, and that's why Dr. Khan here is chiding the British, and he's saying it's because of them and their policies that this has happened, and we wanted a Pathanistan, but we wanted self-determination, but that was never given to us. And we'll see also that how the people from frontier, like a good chunk of people from the frontier, they did not agree to the referendum. They did not agree to the results of this referendum, and they did not consider the Pakistani government as the legitimate ruler of the province.
What's really interesting?
And also,
I was sorry to interrupt. I wanted to connect with the referendum. Yesterday, we spoke about the parts of this referendum that actually talked about the Northeast. So you were having similar issues in the Northeast, where this referendum, was basically people were not happy about what was going on.
Yeah. And we see this in the newspapers every day. Some organization or some group is saying to their primary audience that the disintegration or the division of these either states or the country as a whole should not take place, and do whatever you can. Some even call for armed resistance in terms of, to do anything. Even if you have to take up arms, do that, but do not let the country disintegrate or divide into two. Or some were also in, like, this was also in the level, in the pan India level, this happening at the pan India level, but also this was happening in localized levels. Like, people were specifically also asking for Bengal and Punjab not to be partitioned. Here we see the words of Ram Manohar Lohia in the that are featured in the newspaper. He wanted August 15 a real red letter day. By that means he was a socialist leader. He also founded the Congress Socialist Party. So what he meant by this was, he wanted on the day of August 15th or 14th, whatever he mentions those two dates specifically. He wanted the government to nationalize the industries, or declare the end of zamindari, because he says without that you cannot fight capitalism, which he connects to the coming of British, that the British got the capitalism into the
East India
subcontinent.
Company.
Yeah, and that's why you should declare the end of zamindari, which eventually did happen in 1951, when the articles of constitution were amended by the first amendment, and zamindari was abolished, so that the states could make laws to hereditary, so that hereditary zamindari could be put an end to.
Yes, I know. We've interviewed many people who were impacted by this. It's interesting because in Pakistan, the system was not brought to an end, but in India, it
Yeah.
was. And, you know, a lot of people hail it, and yet it also adversely impacted a lot of people.
Now we move on to 20th July. So, like we just saw, that this cabinet was divided into two. So here's a list of India and Pakistan cabinet ministers, and here we see India. There's Pandit Nehru, who's the External Affairs Minister, the Commonwealth Relations and Legislative, and then Sardar Patel has the Home Ministry and IB Ministry also. Rajendra Prasad has Food and Agriculture. Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad has Education. C. Rajagopalachari has Industries and Supplies. John Mathai has Transport, Railways and Communications. Sardar Baldev Singh has Defense. C.H. Bhabha has Work, Mines and Power and Commerce. And Jagjeevan Ram has the portfolio of Labor and Health. And Pakistan has a much shorter cabinet. They have Liaquat Ali Khan has Finance, External Affairs and Commonwealth, as well as Defense. Uh, II Chandigarh has Commerce, Industries and Supplies. Abdur Rab Nishtar has Communications, Railways, Transport, Broadcasting. Ghazanfar Ali Khan has Health, Food and Agriculture, and Jogendra Nath has the Legislation as well as Labor. So I think he was the only one in that cabinet who was a Hindu.
Very interesting.
Yeah, on the right hand we have the image of Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who was very famous for drawing the Radcliffe Line, and he had arrived at Lahore on 14 July. So it was a snapshot that the paper has taken.
Thank you for sharing his photo.
Yeah. Now we, of course, the provincial politics is still going on. Which states were willing to join the dominion of either India or Pakistan, and which were just wanted to declare independence. Travancore on this day, the day that the India Independence Bill had the royal assent, it declared independence, but it was ready to collaborate with India on matters of common concern, which mostly meant finances, finances, which would include currency, defense, as well as external affairs. So the three most important portfolios that they were ready to collaborate on that, but they were not ready to give up their autonomy within the dominion.
Very interesting.
Yeah, but the Nizam was not ready to give up any autonomy at all, and they would have preferred the British suzerainty and over the Indian suzerainty, but that did not happen. The moment India Independence Bill received royal assent, they left all that suzerainty to either of the two newly formed countries. So here is the Congress leader and the president of the Free Berar committee, Mr. Brijlal Bayani. He was when threatened with aggression from the Nizam. He said that the Pan India Congress will come to the rescue of the people of Berar, and that they will get what they want, which is the integration of Berar into the dominion of India.
And then what happened to Travancore? What eventually happened?
It was brought under the dominion of India.
And how so? Because the Maharaja here seems to have broadcast independence.
But we see over the few days. So the thing was, it was happening daily, and even with only Hyderabad, only I think Hyderabad and Goa, they were brought under by army. But most of them, they shed their hardliner stance in terms of not integrating into India, because they realized that that's what also the people want in terms of more security, more employment, and just more resources, more access to resources. So they were slowly. So in the last few weeks, we would see the Maharaja of Travancore not ready for any collaboration on any of the common portfolios or concerns with the India. But over the weeks, we see him shed that stance, and over the next few weeks, we also will see him.
So let me challenge that quickly. That's what we see from the newspapers, but what we hear from oral history is that sometimes a lot of subversive means were used, like a lot of arm twisting behind the scenes and threats behind the scenes were used to arm twist the Maharajas into accepting
the
so I'm not sure if it was necessarily by choice.
It was not by choice, but it was just the decision that they had to make, because they realized that there's no other way out of it. And sometimes that was because of the people's mandate, and sometimes because of the arm twisting. And we see both mentioned in the daily news that came. But since Amrita Bazar Patrika was more of a, it wanted a full, the editor was more in support of a unionist stance. So that's what we see in the newspaper also. And of course, when we read these newspapers, we have to just read the author before you read the substance that they produce. So that's what we have to do with newspapers.
And Debanjan, when he came a few weeks ago, he was talking about how we even need to pay attention to the actual newspaper, because every newspaper had a certain political alignment and hence a political bias.
Yeah. So, for example, Amrita Bazar Patrika was heavily, because it. So this one was based out of Allahabad, the one that I'm using right now. So that's the stance that we see. That's a very pro India stance, an anti-Muslim League stance. We also see, and then there was other newspapers. For example, there was Civil and Military Gazette that was straight up the mouthpiece of the British government. And that's what we see in that, because that is the paper, that most of the paper is just filled with incidences of violence, because that's what they wanted to show, that when the British are leaving finally, the subcontinent has just devolved into a death match between communities. So yeah, the
Very interesting.
Right. Here we see the result of the referendum that was held in the frontier, and Muslim League gets a technical majority. So the valid votes for Pakistan were 289,244, and for majority they only needed 286,000. So they were able to clinch that victory by a mere decimal. And that's why Dr. Khan had such a stern message for, and that's why he blamed the British for that, because he said this does not take into account the self-determination. The votes can either be for India or for Pakistan, but it has no scope for that if the people wanted self-determination. And he argued that if that was another option in it, that's what the people would have opted for, a separate Pathanistan. And here we see the Sikhs who were part of the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan, the the Panth that was led by the Master Tara Singh. They had recommended that the members of the Pakistan Constituent Assembly who were Sikhs, they should boycott the Constituent Assembly and should not participate in it at all. And what they wanted was one. safety of minority whoever wanted to cross the border into India. And the larger reason for this was also because Sikhs were also vying for self-determination at this point, which they were not getting, which they, when the even with the division of Punjab, it was mostly, and since it was uh, where the Sikhs were mostly concentrated in at that point, which is Punjab, they wanted the division to happen also on the lines that would take into account the aspirations of the Sikhs for self-determination, which did not happen.
Right.
Yeah, and then now we move on to 22nd July. India decided to be a sovereign, independent republic. They opted to be a federation with elected president. But now this president, what Nehru said about the election of president, he said it shouldn't be on the adult suffrage, because sometimes, and I quote him right here from the paper, that sometimes there is something called too much democracy, and that can be a dangerous thing. So our president should not be elected by the people. It should be elected by the he or she should be elected by the representatives of the people.
Interesting.
Because in any case the president um did not he can only ratify the decisions that were made by the elected representatives, and Nehru thought that if the people would also elect the president, and then he won't be able to take decisions himself but only ratify the decisions of the elected representatives, that would just feel odd. So the exact line he uses is that he's all for democratic procedure, but there is also such a thing called too much democracy. um,
I've
and
heard
then
that
but
in
the
India a lot, that phrase.
Yeah, but then they also had given veto powers for provincial governors, which also the president would have, and this is still the this is still the setup that India follows till now.
Very, very.
Um,
It's very interesting for people to know that the origins of where, some of these rules and
phrases,
regulations came from.
yeah, yeah, and also some of the phrases, because now we see a lot of like phrases like something called too much democracy, or
Right. I hear that a
yeah,
lot.
yeah, and it's interesting to see how these phrases have shifted along the political lines.
Absolutely.
So there was also, like I had mentioned before, the Khudai Khidmatgars, they under the Dr. Khan, they did not agree to the decision of the referendum, because they thought that it did not correctly represent the will of the people. So they declared 15th August would be the establishment of Pathanistan, and they were mobilizing people to make sure that would happen. But eventually that did not happen, and it's still the part of Pakistan. But there were guerrilla movements that were going on to liberate, armed guerrilla movements to liberate Pathanistan, which did not come to fruition.
Very interesting. And what did these armed guerrilla movements, what were some of their actions? Do we know from the news? Because we hear things from the oral histories, of course.
Yeah, they are the now the paper that I am using, it does not have much from what the movements would consider, but it mostly uses the term mobilizing, which I think would be armed resistance, and when the Pakistani army would come to take over and just uh, be there for the be there along the borders, and they would probably have a fight with them and target those particular regiments that were coming in and trying to bring the frontier province into the dominion of Pakistan. So
Okay.
that would mean that.
Was there any involvement of Afghanistan? Do we see that anywhere in any of the printed
Later
material?
we do see. Yeah, later we do see. So the chief minister, who would later be the chief minister, the brother of Dr. Khan, who would later be the chief minister of the frontier province, he would also go on to blame Afghanistan for trying to keep up the issue of Pathanistan for their own political benefits, because it was close to the border, and he would say now just he basically accepted that then province to be the part of Pakistan, and he just blamed Afghanistan later of just trying to rile up things in frontier province to forward their own political gains. So we also see that happen, but that does
Very
not happen till the 60s. This is something that I found really interesting, so I put it up here also. The Indian flag originally wanted the Gandhian charkha to be on the flag, but the reason that they gave of using a chakra instead of charkha was that it was well the design element, it was just bending towards one side and it wasn't looking aesthetically pleasing. So that's why they
interesting.
went with the chakra. But I think an alternate argument would also be they wanted to show what the what James Mill, the utilitarian, called a glorious Indian uh, past, or the golden age of India, and then provided by Dark Ages and then the British Age of Liberation. So I think
Interesting.
that was more of a decision to link to give it a more majoritarian outlook than anything else.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah, that's
And
it.
that's it. Okay,
Yeah.
that was so illuminating. Thank you so much. We didn't have as many headlines I noticed from the Northeast today, but I think the newspapers
Yeah,
we were dealing with were mostly concentrated in the Delhi area, right? The seat of the power,
yeah,
um,
Allahabad.
Allahabad.
But
And so, go
it
ahead.
this paper usually had news instances from Sylhet, from Bengal, and from Dhaka. But this week was mostly concentrated because the India Independence Bill finally had the royal assent. So the news was just more about what the politicians will do about it, how they will go about it, and since also the referendum of Frontier Province was completed, so the news just constant was more about that. Um, yeah, and also there was a sports page at the end, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fahad. That was really great. Do you have anything to add from your personal observations and, connecting the dots around this particular week's news from 47?
um, from this particular week,
Yeah, it was a
from this
pretty important
particular
week. We had
a lot,
the
it was a pretty important, yeah, it was pretty important week, but I think the consequences of this we would probably see in the coming weeks, because right now it was just declared, but we do see Britain trying to form pacts, and like Dr. Khan, like in from my previous presentations, like Dr. Khan had mentioned how Britishers still want to have cordial relationships so that they can stop or launch into Russia, and we see them trying to build defense pacts around these countries, and that's why they also wanted Burma. And they were also trying to settle things with in the Middle East, and we also and this was really important week globally also, because we also see the Jews marching into Jerusalem and trying to take over then that from the Palestinians. And there's also happenings in Indonesia, which this newspaper listed as the new age of imperialism. So what the paper basically meant was they're trying to leave South Asia, but they're trying to venture into Southeast Asia. So yeah.
very interesting,
uh,
very interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining today, and I look forward to catching up with you again probably next weekend, and we'll discuss the rest of the newspaper headlines. All right.
Thank you
Bye,
for having me.
everyone. Please join us again on Monday.
Bye.
This is 75 Days of Partition. We started on June 3rd, and we're going on when, June 3rd is the day the Mountbatten Plan was announced, and we're going on till August 17th. August 17th is the day the Radcliffe Line was announced publicly, and that's actually 75 days altogether. And so we're trying to understand what happened in those 75 days on, these timeline episodes. And otherwise, in between these episodes, we're talking to practitioners who are working on partition, making new discoveries about our past so that we can become more informed citizens.